How many Chinas are there in the world? We'd give you 30 seconds to think, but it's better not to even try. After all, no one's been able to figure out this issue for 50 years. Inside China, it's generally better not to raise this topic under any circumstances. There, it's considered exclusively a question of the Chinese. But even in the USA, the situation will not become clear. On the one hand, there is the 1979 Act on Relations with Taiwan and the 2020 Act on Strengthening Relations with Taiwan. And it seems that the Americans believe that there are two Chinas. But nevertheless, not only visits, but even calls of American officials to Taiwan are extremely rare. Moreover, American corporations like Blizzard mercilessly dismiss and ban employees for any mention of Hong Kong and Taiwan in a negative way. Why did this happen? And how did the history of the confrontation between Beijing and Taipei begin? Make yourself comfortable, friends. All the answers will be in the next couple of minutes. Usually, videos about this topic suggest going to 1949, but we will dig deeper and start with the 8,000th year BC. It's the end of the Stone Age, better known as the Neolithic. So-called Austronesians lived somewhere on the territory of the modern Chinese province of Fujian. The group got its name from the language, and these guys were quite advanced for their time. It's believed that they were among the first on the planet to invent sail technology, and they also had a primitive analog of paper. The Austronesians were mainly engaged in agriculture, in which they achieved good success. But around the 5th millennium BC, they came under the pressure of more numerous Sino-Tibetan people, or as they're also called, Tibetan Chinese. This led to a migration that would be known in history as the expansion of the Austronesians. First of all, as part of the expansion, the ancient people left eastern China for Taiwan. It was familiar to them, because the first Austronesian settlements on the island date back as far as the 8,000th year BC. And then, thanks to technological advancement, the Austronesians settled the whole of Oceania. Their descendants can be found in Indonesia, the Philippines, Polynesia, and even Madagascar. And for us, the main interest is, and there the Austronesians became the ancestors of the Aborigines of the island. As of 2020, more than 500,000 Taiwanese are considered direct descendants of prehistoric Austronesians. Up until the beginning of our era, China didn't really care about the island, but the Taiwan Strait and the location of the island could not be left unnoticed. Already in the 3rd century AD, Taiwan was mentioned in Chinese chronicles as an island of barbarians. In 239 AD, mainland China sent a 10,000-strong expeditionary force to the island. In 605, the operation was repeated, and mission brought to the mainland Aborigines, who were taught Chinese and used in negotiations. There is little reliable information from those times, but it is known that in the 7th century, on the Penghu Island and in Taiwan itself, there were already villages founded by mainland Chinese. And the Japanese pirates, like the Chinese, also loved to use no man's Taiwan as their base. However, it was a dangerous business. The Aborigines of Taiwan were quite belligerent. They had a widely practiced custom. To confirm his maturity for marriage, the groom had to bring the head of a Chinese to the elders. Mongols, who came to power in China in the 13th century, were violent themselves. And during the Yuan dynasty, the Penghu Islands and part of Taiwan came under the control of the mainland. A wave of migration began from not very prosperous areas to the islands. And since then, the inexorable process of displacing the Aborigines of Taiwan closer to the mountains has started, while the most suitable lands were occupied by the mainland Chinese. Nowadays, the descendants of migrants from Fujian and Guangdong provinces make up the majority of the population of modern Taiwan. However, before that, they, like most of the planet, had to suffer because of the European colonizers. In 1517, the Portuguese sailed past the island and gave it the name Formosa, which translates to beautiful. And then the Dutch from the East India Campaign were not long in coming, and China fell out of the equation of the island ownership for which the Spaniards and the Dutch were fighting. The Dutch won, but their full control of the island lasted only 20 years. Nevertheless, during this time, they managed to remain in the history of Taiwan. It was the Dutch who helped Chinese migrants oust local Aborigines, and they taught the Taiwanese how to use cattle to work in the fields as well as various fertilizers. And, as the cherry on the cake, the Dutch left behind educated Aborigines who can write. But it's not worth deluding yourself too much, as in the case of other colonies, Europeans were mainly interested in profit. Therefore, uprisings were commonplace. According to the results of one of them, in 1662, Taiwan was taken by representatives of the Ming dynasty. This, by the way, was the earliest case in history when a colony was completely withdrawn from Europeans, and the first documented case when Taiwan was declared as an independent state. Days went by, and on the mainland, the Ming dynasty was replaced by the Qing dynasty. The generals and residents who fled from it founded the Dunning state on the island. In Europe, it was called the Kingdom of Formosa, but it did not live long. Already in 1683, the Manchus of the Qing dynasty, with the help of the Dutch and sanctions, regained control of Taiwan. From then and until 1895, the island was under the full control of mainland China. However, there were nuances as well. Firstly, in the Qin Empire, Taiwan was not taken seriously, considered to be the backyard of China. Secondly, a significant part of the island's population remembered the traditions of the Ming Empire and resisted the guys from Qin, who were considered invaders. And thirdly, in the 19th century, the Opium Wars began. The UK did not like China's independence, and the fact that it does not particularly want to trade its opium. The countries put together a coalition and quickly defeated the troops of the Qin dynasty, having started famine, devastation, and drug addiction in the country. And Taiwan was seen by Western powers as an excellent springboard for conducting military and political actions against China. The island's trade with Europe and Japan has grown significantly, and when China paid attention to that, it was already too late. Nevertheless, the attempts were good. In 1885, Taiwan received the status of a full-fledged province. Through the efforts of the Chinese government, the first railway was built there. Ports and infrastructure were repaired. The period is warmly remembered even by modern authorities of Taiwan. We will never know how the story would have continued, because in 1894, China and Japan started a war. Japan won, and with the support of the West, took Taiwan. Nevertheless, China did not recognize the terms of the agreement. For the Japanese, the island was the first test of the pen in colonial affairs, and in just a couple of decades, Taiwan has become the most advanced territory in Southeast Asia, with the exception of Japan itself. In 1895, there were 50 kilometers of railways on the island. 10 years later, under the leadership of the Japanese, there were 500 of them. Taiwan was electrified. New agricultural technologies were imported, and by the First World War, it was a world-class economy. It was like this until the Second World War. However, it is worth noting that the Japanese ruled the island as harshly as possible. There was even a glimpse when in elections, the Governor-General of Taiwan, the local citizen, was chosen. Nevertheless, before the Second World War, Japanese militarism took its toll. Taiwan began to be assimilated and even conscripted into the army on the side of Japan. You probably know how it ended. We will only add that many residents of Taiwan participated on the side of Japan in the Nanjing Massacre and other war crimes. But most still liked the return of Taiwan to China following the results of the Second World War. However, there were some incidents. At the Potsdam Conference, Japan seemed to be forced to abandon Taiwan, but sensible peace treaties were not drawn up until 1951. And even then, when signing the document in San Francisco, China was not even invited, and the country's rights to Taiwan were somehow secured, de facto, suspending the issue of the island's nationality in the air. Disorder reigned not only in documents and contracts. Since 1927, a civil war has been raging in China. The Republic of China and the Chinese Communists shared territories which were a platform of confrontation between the great powers even before the Second World War. The Republic, for example, was supported by Germany in the 30s, and the Communists, of course, by the USSR. Because of the war with Japan and the subsequent World War, the Chinese were not up to internal differences. But as soon as the situation got better, the old disagreements returned. The Communists and Republicans, in the very first second after the surrender of Japan, began frantically taking cities and practicing who would seize more territory in order to declare the legitimacy of their government. Mao Zedong won the Civil War together with the Communists, and Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang evacuated to Taiwan, where since 1949 they have de facto established a dictatorship. First of all, Chiang Kai-shek proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of China on the island, and the second introduced martial law. It lasted for a long 38 years and is considered the longest in history. Martial law has gone down in history as the White Terror, in which many thousands of Taiwanese have been the victims of arrests, torture, and executions on suspicion of collaborating with the Communist Party of mainland China. Total censorship was imposed on the island. strikes were banned, and Taiwan's defensive lines were actively increased. In the second half of the 20th century, there were several active phases of confrontation at once. In 1955, 1958, and 1995, the full-scale wars of the PRC in Taiwan did not begin only by a miracle. The USA has always played a decisive role in the events. Immediately after the Second World War, American specialists were engaged in economic recovery and investment. Wolff-Ledeshinsky carried out an excellent agrarian reform, which led to defeudalization and the establishment of market relations. Labor-intensive industries were also growing, which the United States carefully recovered with its military power. In 1979, an Act on Relations with Taiwan was adopted, implying direct military support to the island in the event of a military clash with the PRC. And at the UN, initially, it was the representative of Taiwan who spoke from China. However, along with the formal support of the island, the great powers could not help but notice the growing potential of the PRC. Mainland China took a seat in the UN in 1971, becoming the only representative of the state. Taiwan has since tried to challenge this 24 times and submit its own application. But time after time, under pressure from mainland China, the application was rejected. The rhetoric of the United States has also changed. Instead of unequivocal support for Taiwan, the so-called policy of strategic duality came into play. On the one hand, America and its satellites support the island state. There are informal embassies and authorities of Taiwan in almost all Western countries. But on the other hand, no one formally recognizes them, and the United States officially recognizes the People's Republic of China as the sole legitimate representative of the people of China. This gives rise to incidents like the fact that in 2020, another act was adopted to strengthen U.S. relations with Taiwan. On the other hand, the United States conduct all official negotiations only with China, forbidding its corporations to even mention the independence of the island. Periodically, the situation fluctuates to one point or the other depending on the current relations between the United States and China. But the status quo established in the 80s more or less persists to this day. China adheres to the concept of a single country, while Taiwan strives for official independence. Someone in the world supports the position of someone else. And some are sitting on two chairs, trying to get their own from China and from Taiwan. After all, there is something to get. Taiwan's economy grew at one of the fastest rates in the world, and now it is a paradise of semiconductors, electronics industry, and even nuclear power. Of course, the main trading partner of the island is mainland China. Despite the fact that Taiwan does not de facto make any taxes or contributions to the treasury of the People's Republic of China, the turnover of mutual trade is growing from year to year. Along the way, the democratization of society on the island is growing from year to year. Martial law was finally lifted in 1987. Direct presidential elections were held in 1996, and by the beginning of the noughties, the positions of Kuomintang, which had ruled the island for half a century, had weakened. At the moment, tensions in the region are rising again. An explanation of the current situation is already politics. Our business is history, and we have told you the story of two Chinas who seem to be united, but do not seem to be. If you like the video, we'll be glad to see your upvotes and comments on the topic. In the meantime, see you next time, friends.